Hello, Whappers. This is Mr. Abeyounis, and welcome to Module 2. This week we'll be talking about the Cold War, which is picking up right after World War II, and a lot of people would even argue started during World War II. So what are some of the essential questions that we'll be talking about today? So we'll first start off as what is the Cold War and what was the historical context of the Cold War? Theoretically, you can put it at 1945 until about 1992. So this is something that lasted about 45-ish years of our history. So it was quite a bit of a long time. Another question is, what were the causes and the effects of this actual war that happened? Because it's actually not a war; it's a cold. It's a war the reason why it's cold is because there was no actual hot fire. There was no actual shooting at each other. And what are some ways that the United States and Soviet Union competed against each other for influence around the world? If you ever heard the phrase, if you're not with us, you're against us, that very much kind of applies to what's going on in the Cold War. You're either with us or you're against us, and you're for the Soviet Union. And there's really no in between. Not for most countries, we try to put it that way at least. And then, of course, how does communism actually affect countries like China in this case? How does communism actually work in real life? And as I mentioned before, even though you say you're communist, in most cases, what your government is not really communist. It's more of a dictatorship. And then, as I mentioned, the Cold War roughly ends in 1992 is what we say it ends. So what caused this end of the Cold War? What finally caused the Soviet Union to collapse? So again, this is our lecture. So what I need you guys to do this week is to listen to me talk through this lecture, take notes as I'm going through it, and then once this lecture is done, we'll have another web quest for you to complete. And if you need to pause me because I talk too fast or whatnot, please feel free to take a pause of this video and keep up with my talking, because I know sometimes us teachers can talk too fast. All right, so let's talk off with the beginnings of the Cold War. And the reason why there's no official beginning date of the Cold War, but a lot of people say the beginning of the Cold War actually started during World War II. During the war, the big three, as we called them, you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And when FDR dies, it becomes Truman. But essentially, you had the big leaders of the countries coming together in these conferences. And pretty much for the last year of the war, we knew that we were going to win the war over Germany. So what it really came down to was us negotiating. What's it going to look like once the war is going to end? How are we going to divide up Europe? How are we going to continue on as a society? So some of the big conferences we can talk about. Number one is the Yalta Conference, when we decide that what are we going to do with Germany, and the answer is we're just going to split it up. So there's actually going to be an East Germany and a West Germany. And also it's beginning rumblings of the United Nations, another peacekeeping organization, just similar to the League of Nations, but with a little bit more power, especially considering the United States is actually going to agree to join it. But even during these meetings, there's already that rivalry forming between the Soviet Union and the United States. And one reason why is because we have a special relationship with England. FDR and Churchill considered themselves friends, and Stalin was kind of like the third person out of these meetings. And of course, if you think about it, ideologically speaking, FDR and Churchill were capitalists and they believed in democracy, whereas Stalin was a communist. And the only really reason why they were even allies in the first place is because Hitler betrayed Stalin during the war. So it's like, well, I'll be an ally. The enemy of my enemy is a friend, but once that other enemy is defeated, that alliance starts falling apart. The other important conference I want to mention, which is in the bottom part of this bullet points right here, is the Potsdam Conference. So during this conference, again, when the war is still happening, we tried to get Stalin to promise that those Eastern European countries that he invades and conquers during the war will be free elections. He won't just force them to be communist. And during the conference, Stalin begrudgingly agrees to that. But of course, I don't think he ever really meant to actually do it. And from Stalin's perspective, he thinks, communism is under attack. These capitalists are just trying to destroy communism so then that, bigwig merchants will just take over, the world. And so he sees capitalism as a threat. And, trying to install these free elections that will end up with being in capitalist societies will just make, capitalism get closer and closer to the Soviet Union himself. Whereas he wants to use those countries as satellite states, which are really just, states that are basically kind of act as a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. And these are kind of like the ones in the orbit of the Soviet Union. And here's a little picture of what I'm talking about right here. And that big red line is going to be coined by Churchill as the Iron Curtain. So basically, to the right, to the eastern part of that, is going to be all these countries that are communist, and then to the left in green are the ones that are going to be democracies and capitalist. And if you notice right there, you can see that Germany actually gets divided in half. Western Germany is going to be the democracy is a capitalist, and the Eastern Germany is going to be communist. And they're going to remain two separate countries for decades and decades and decades, and not until the fall of the Soviet Union does Germany become unified again. All right, so as I mentioned, what are some of these causes of the Soviet Union and the United States having this friction and rivalry against each other? I'd say the number one is economic systems. You have capitalism, which basically says, survival of the fittest, versus communism, which ideally, remember what communism is. It's a classless society where everyone is equal and everything owns everything and as a community. Now, in practice, you can say that never really happens, but at least ideologically, that's what's supposed to happen. So communists will look at capitalists as a corrupt society that eventually is going to eat itself whole and destroy the world. And yeah, so that's basically what they see for us. And the other part of it is the political system, democracy versus communism, where supposedly we would say we want everyone to have a voice, whereas communism would ultimately, you could say their goal is to really not even have a government. Whereas, of course, we know in practice, their political system is a dictatorship. In this case, in the Soviet Union, it's going to be Stalin in charge. All right, so what are some big international bodies you need to know during the Cold War? Well, number one is the one we already mentioned, which is the United Nations, which was created in response to the World War II happening and basically people recognizing that the League of Nations was too weak. So they tried to make the United Nations a little bit more strong, a little bit more power. And of course, the United States is also a part of it. And you could argue the United Nations has been successful. We haven't had a big global war, since World War II. However, a lot of critics still point out that United Nations still can't prevent all wars, and genocides still happen today. If you want to know about a genocide that's still happening, what is it? It's in the Middle East. I think it's not Yemen. I think it's Yemen. It might be. It's in the Middle East. I think it's Yemen going on right now. I'll look it up after this lecture, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. The other two big organizations we can talk about is NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And essentially, if you look back at our previous MAC and our last slide, NATO is those Western European countries that are democracies, and the Warsaw Pact is the communist countries with Eastern Europe. And these are military alliances that supposedly say if one country gets invaded, like if Western Germany gets invaded by a communist, all the other countries will team up and help save Western Germany from those communist forces, and vice versa. The Warsaw Pact does not exist today. However, I would say NATO does still exist today. Although you can ask, why does it still exist? Because communism supposedly has been defeated. And I guess some people, defenders of NATO, would say, one, well, Russia is still on the rise and still a threat to Eastern Europe. And two, NATO says they've actually expanded their role to also being a terrorist fighting organization. All right, so what's some big foreign policy goals of the United States? And the biggest one would be the containment theory. And connected to that would also be the domino theory later on. And essentially what this, if you ever look at a map of the world, think about a map of the world where no communism exists, and eventually the Soviet Union becomes communist, and then the Eastern Europe becomes communist, and then China is going to become communist. All of a sudden, if you're American and if you think communism equals evil, that's what Americans thought, you look at this map and you get really scared really quickly, like how fast communism is spreading. So our first goal is containment. We need to stop the spread of this contagion, this disease, to make it not spread to anyone else. And as a result of this containment theory, we get involved in a lot of things. Number one, you can see on there is the Marshall Plan. I know the map is kind of hard to see in that bottom right-hand corner, but essentially what this Marshall Plan is, we give a lot of these Western European countries money and economic aid because we worried if we don't give these countries economic aid because they got devastated by World War II, maybe communism will rise up in those countries. So we want to support those countries and prevent it. And that also gets us involved in other wars as well as part of domino theory, where we believe if one country falls to communism, a set of dominoes will start falling and other countries start falling. So very famously, I would say, we got involved in Vietnam for over 2 decades trying to prevent the fall of communism there. And we also got involved in Korea, mainly because we worried that if Koreans fall to communism, maybe Japan will then fall for communism. And this is just maps kind of reinforcing it. So you can see how Eastern Europe became communism and how that would freak a lot of the United States off, how close communism is encouraging on Western European democracies. And then, of course, you see some political cartoons, which is really just highlighting the fact that we see communism as evil and as this huge existential threat that we need to stop. And that middle picture right there, you can see it's a graveyard of countries that we've lost to communism and how sad it is and how we need to stop it. All right, so some big events during the Cold War during this time period. I don't think I mentioned this before, but the city of Berlin, even though it was surrounded by Eastern Germany, was actually half of it was still was given to the United States to be occupied. So half of Berlin was actually capitalist and democratic, but it was surrounded by communism. So one of the things that Stalin tried to do was make Berlin 100% communist. So he figured if he cuts off all train access to Berlin, that basically Berlin would starve itself to the point when eventually it'd have to give in and become communist. United States, we saw this happening, and we decided we're not going to let Stalin take Berlin. So we did something called the Berlin Airlift. Which is where we just took a bunch of airplanes and we constantly flew it over Berlin and dropped off food and aid to them for several months until eventually Stalin realized that this wasn't going to work and he ended the blockade. Another thing that happened during the Cold War is the Berlin Wall, which becomes a big symbol of the Cold War itself. So as I mentioned, Berlin, half of Berlin is going to be a democracy and still capitalist, whereas the other half is not. And one of the problems that the Soviet Union had was the economics of communism could not keep up with the economics of capitalism. So a lot of people in Eastern Germany would try to flee Eastern Germany, the communist, and go to the capitalist in Western Berlin. And as a result of that, that doesn't make Stalin look good. So he actually builds a wall out, and that wall is really to prevent people from escaping communism and going to Western Berlin. And yes, there were guns set up there as well. So if they caught you sneaking across that wall, you could end up getting shot and killed. And that wall is going to stay up for most of the Cold War until November 1989. Another big touchstone moment during the Cold War was in 1957, and that is the launching of a satellite called Sputnik. And the Soviets actually do it first. So if you're an American during the 1947 and you see this satellite above your head going past you, all of a sudden you get worried because one, you don't even know what the satellite's doing. The Soviets now control space and they can see everything that's going on, and it makes Americans worried that we're losing the technology game versus the Soviet Union. So we ourselves, this is when we start doing our own space race game, which famously ends with Apollo 11 when we actually land a man on the moon first. So even though we were late to the game, we eventually were able to catch up to the Soviet Union and pass them with the space race. Another thing that gets connected to this technology race is the arm race, which is when we start building nuclear weapons and then they build nuclear weapons. And essentially it comes down to the point when we could destroy the world 1,000 times over between the amount of nuclear bombs both countries have. But the idea behind it is, well, the Soviet Union will never bomb us because if they bomb us, we'll bomb them. So it's a mutually assured destruction. And we do get a lot of close instances in the Cold War where a nuclear war almost happened to the point when eventually in the late 1980s where we both decide we need to actually cut back on the amount of nuclear weapons we have because we realize having all these nuclear weapons increases the likelihood that the world will be destroyed. All right, one of the examples of a hot flash, an almost hot flash of this Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Cuba is the island in the Caribbean Ocean that becomes communist under Fidel Castro, and he seeks aid from the Soviet Union to prevent the United States from possibly invading him. So the Soviet Union tries to ship him nuclear weapons. Again, part of this Cold War mentality where if now that these nuclear weapons are going to be literally 90 miles away from the United States, and that makes a lot of Americans nervous when they think about this. The idea is that we could get get bombed so quickly that we don't even have a chance to respond to it. So President Kennedy, who was our president during the time of this nuclear missile crisis, actually blockades Cuba and prevents the Soviets from sending these bombs, these missiles to Cuba. So this is an incident that did not result in a nuclear warfare, but got really, really close to a nuclear one. All right, so during the Cold War, again, this happened for about 40, 50 years. And as I mentioned before, either with us or against us, there was a lot of what we call proxy wars that happened during the Cold War. So even though the United States and the Soviet Union did not head-to-head fight each other, we chose a lot of other areas around the world where we fought for the hearts and minds for those countries, and actually did lead to war indirectly between the Soviet Union and the United States. So I mentioned the big ones would be the Korean War and the Vietnam Wars, where the United States jumped in there trying to prevent the spread of communism. Newsflash: I would argue we ended up losing the Vietnam War, and theoretically for the Korean War, we have the North Korea and South Korea today. Theoretically, we never actually signed a peace treaty, so technically we're still at war with the North Korea until we actually sign that treaty. But if you're looking at that map above us right there, you can see there's a lot of red flashes in South America and in Asia. And Middle East and Africa. So there's a lot of other smaller conflicts that happened as well, where we replaced governments and whatnot. And all this was done in the name of we want to prevent the spread of communism and keep capitalism going. All right. The other big communism thing that happens during this Cold War time period that's kind of connected to the Soviet Union, but not necessarily connected to the Soviet Union, is China. So a brief history on China and its role in becoming communism was actually going pre-World War II. And that is, there was actually a civil war going on with China between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by the communists, which eventually is going to be led by Mao. And they were actually having a civil war between communists and nationalists, with the nationalists the one winning, the one that we were supporting during the 1920s. Then during the 1930s, actually the Civil War in China hit a pause button, and the main reason why is because Japan decides to invade China and take it over. So remember how I mentioned in Asia, World War II, you could argue started in the 1930s, and this is the reason why. Japan with imperialism actually came in and invaded. And as a result, communism and China and the nationalists stopped fighting each other until after the war is over. And then after the war is over, the communists and nationalists start fighting each other again, and the communists are able to win. And as you can see on there, 1949, Mao Zedong officially declares the People's Republic of China. Whereas Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, they run away to a small island, Taiwan, and they declare themselves the Republic of China. And of course, I think it's kind of funny. Officially, for most of the Cold War, since we don't like communism, we said Taiwan is the official country, the official government of China. And please ignore that big country right next to them. They're not the real China. And here's a little picture right there showing you again. You see Taiwan's that small country, and then you have Taiwan, and then you have China, which is the much larger country. And if you ever pay attention to the news again about Taiwan and China, technically Taiwan is part of China now. However, they are very sensitive about this communism thing going on right here. I think the funny example earlier this year or last year was an airline like United Airlines actually had an airplane saying going to countries such as Taiwan, and China threatened to cut off United Airlines from actually having airplanes fly to China unless they made Taiwan a subcategory of China. So you'll see that every now and then where China is very, very particular, saying Taiwan is part of us. But at the same time, Taiwan still has remnants of democracies going on there. So even though they're a part of China, there's still a lot of resistance going on there. All right, so during the, 1950s and 60s, what are some big events that happened during China? And the two big ones I want you guys to at least be aware of is the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution the Great Leap Forward was essentially when China said, Mao Zedong had this great idea about we're a farming republic, so therefore I want to make everyone, culturally, basically jump forward technologically, and this actually resulted into a bunch of basically famine that happened because just trying to force everyone to farm in basically low technology ways, just caused less production of food, which caused a lot of people to starve. And then the Cultural Revolution was Mao's reaction to basically a bunch of intellectuals doing things like even questioning communism as the best form of government. So when that happened, to back up a little bit, he actually tried to encourage free intellectual thought until that free intellectual thought went against communism. So he would actually, for the culture part of it is, he sent a lot of those intellectuals to be quote unquote re-educated in the countryside on how to be good communism. And as a result, a lot of these policies in the 1920s, up to 20 million people died of starvation in China alone. So think about that for a second. When we talk about the greatest, genocides in history with, Stalin and Hitler, Mao Zedong maybe inadvertently also caused a lot of death during his rule. All right, so what caused the end of the Cold War? And the answer is, as I kind of mentioned earlier, was the détente, which is basically we need to realize to limit the amount of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union. And also the realization amongst the Soviet Union that economically speaking, they could not keep up with capitalism, and they were on the verge of an economic collapse. So the leader during that time period, the 1980s, was Gorbachev, and he set up two different policies. One is Glasnost, which is openness, and Perestroika, which is restructuring, trying to relax the basically totalitarianism of the government, try to make it less militaristic, I should say, and even start introducing later on some capitalist thing as well, and slowly start even getting some democratic going on here. If you talk, Gorbachev is still alive today. Some people can look at Gorbachev, as the Soviets would look at him as former Soviets, as basically the guy who gave up on the Soviet Union. He should have kept on fighting. However, I think most historians look at Gorbachev, he was basically the inevitable was going to happen, where the Soviet Union was slowly falling apart economically and they just couldn't, compete with it. And one thing I want you guys to think about here, and what the Soviets thought about here too, a lot of those nuclear weapons were in those satellite countries. So if the Soviet Union fell, one of the worries would happen is what would happen to those nuclear weapons? Who would eventually take over those countries? And what happens to their dictator that maybe would not care so much about using those nuclear weapons? Like, sure, let's go for it. So Gorbachev, especially for him, he decided they needed to start transitioning peacefully instead of having this big sudden collapse that could have been even more chaos. This picture right here was from 1989 from Ronald Reagan in Berlin. So very famously, he had a speech saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, please tear down this wall." And sure enough, a few months later, that wall was torn down. The Soviet Union still kept on standing, but officially they started breaking up in 1991. I think 1992 is officially when the modern-day Russia formed. And one of the things that happens, the Soviet Union divided up into 14 other countries, or 15 countries, I think if you included Russia. So those countries are now divided. Although if you listen to Putin talking today, one of the big, militaristic things of Russia today is they want to become a global power, and they want to get those countries back again. And here's just a little cartoon showing you right there, the USSR sinks, and you can see all those other countries are those countries that split off from that Soviet Union. All right, so that's it for today for our lecture. So just like next week, what I want you guys to do is to go to the link in the Schoology and complete a web class. It's on Google Forms. You don't have to upload anything. Once you complete the form, it will take your answers, and I will know you got the answers. For feedback, it also will tell you what my answers were for those questions, so you can see what you got right or got wrong. For next week, I'll just announce again, on Thursday, we will have a 2 o'clock chat again. Since it was asked of me, I will do a Kahoot first, and after the Kahoot's done, if anyone has any questions, I will stay back for some questions. All right, guys, please stay safe, and I'm supposed to say something about a YouTube sign out, so something about following and liking me. So please do that too, I guess. All right, see you guys.